Open up the door, it's Dave! Who?
Hey everyone, it's Dave. Welcome to another edition of Just What Do You Think You're Doing, Dave? On today's show, I wanted to talk about how we acquire knowledge. There are many ways to acquire knowledge. You can look at the world around you. You can read a book. You can attend a lecture. You can watch a TV show. Heck, the internet sometimes is a good resource too, depending on the source, of course. You might learn something. And it's really kind of interesting to acquire knowledge and think about how things come together when you acquire that knowledge. What things can you learn? But honestly, the observable universe, using your eyes, your intuition, and understanding things around you is really the best way to acquire knowledge and really learn something about things that are going on around you. So if you look at the world around you and you stand outside and you study things, you might find things that otherwise you wouldn't know. You might understand something at a deeper level than you might ever would have thought that you could. And the best way to use this sort of principle of acquiring knowledge through the observable universe is through something called the scientific method. The scientific method, as the name implies, is really about applying science and rigor around things that you see. What you want to do is come up with sort of a way of looking at things and then trying to determine whether that makes sense or not. So the scientific method actually came around in about the 17th century. And it was a group of people who wanted to look at the world around them and understand it better. So they came up with more rigor around it. They came up with this way of looking at the universe and saying, hey, if I apply knowledge and some skepticism to this problem, maybe I can solve it. And so the basic pillars, the things that you want to do when you're looking at the scientific method are to go ahead and think about what's the question I'm trying to ask? What are the things that I want to solve for? Then I want to do a little bit of background research to understand what it is I'm looking at and what it is I see and kind of understand what it is I'm trying to get to. Then I want to form a hypothesis. And hypothesis is really just a way of questioning what you see and putting it in a form that says I can prove or disprove this by looking at what I see. So when I stand outside and I look at whether I put a white piece of paper or a black piece of paper on the ground and which one gets hotter, I can form a hypothesis that says the black piece will absorb more heat and will be hotter than the white piece. Then I want to set about doing an experiment to try and figure out if that's true. And the experiment can be very simple. You could just put two pieces of paper on the ground. You could touch them with your fingers. You could get a little more specific and actually measure the temperature if you wanted to, and so on. Then what you're going to do is get your findings, put them together, and then come up with a conclusion. That's it. That is the scientific method. So I've just given you a basic science experiment you can do using the scientific method that's really, really simple. Now, you can make it more complex than that. You can add variables to it. You can add other things that you want to test. It could be more complicated than that. You could do pretty much anything. Whatever your mind can dream up, you can probably experiment on or find a way to experiment on at least a part of it and learn something about what's going on around you. It's really, really easy. And I've given you a simple example. You could make it more complex if you want. You can come up with other things that you could do. You could make it more detailed. There are also things you can add to it to make it a little more experimental in a sense, where you say, would it be better to water a plant once a week or twice a week? You're using the scientific method, but you're applying a little more rigor around it. Now, one of the important things about the scientific method is you have to come into it with a very healthy amount of skepticism. You have to keep an open mind. You can't come into it with a preconceived notion. Yes, your hypothesis is you think that this may happen, but you can't come into it saying, well, I know that's going to happen and I'm going to prove it. That's not the way this works. You have to be a skeptic. You have to keep an open mind and think about whether this is going to be true or not. And it's really, really cool when you stop and think about being open-minded about things. When you open your mind up and you think about, could this happen? Does it make a difference? You'll learn something. And you may learn something in the research that helps guide you a little more. Sometimes when we get a little more sophisticated in some of our experiments we want to do, we find out that, if I did a little bit more with this experiment, I could learn something else. And as I'm doing the research to decide how to do that experiment, I might actually learn something new that I didn't know before that may guide me a little bit further down the path. And that is what's really cool about the whole method of, this experimentation and using the scientific method. It's really something that's amazing in our world, and we can use it to look at the observable universe and come up with conclusions about things. And I always like to think that the more you keep an open mind and ask questions, the better off we all are. Ask questions about everything. I always told my kids, don't be afraid to ask questions. The worst that could happen is perhaps someone tells you you're asking too many questions, please stop. But more than likely, you're going to get engaged in a conversation and have more questions that lead to other questions. You're going to learn more along the way because you're asking questions about what you see. And then sometimes you reach a point where you go, that doesn't sound right to me. And you stop and think about it a little more. And you realize that maybe there's something missing and you need to do a little more experimentation or do a little science around it. And if you're talking to, say, someone who's a little bit knowledgeable on the topic, a science teacher or something, you might learn that, well, maybe I do need to do a little more experimentation. And they may help you come up with an experiment that you can do to use the scientific method and come up with something that you want to prove or disprove in that case. So it's really, really cool. And I just wanted to share with you the idea of using the scientific method as a means to get to something meaningful, to actually help yourself to learn, to grow, and to understand the world around you. There's a lot of things that we can learn, and we should take our time to spend the time and look at it. You'll see on upcoming videos, I'm going to be talking about how to apply the scientific method to some very specific things. I want to know if this, and I'm going to set up an experiment to do it. And sometimes they're really, really simple experiments. You can break it down into something that's very easy and then go after it and try it out because there's ways to do that. A lot of times you just have to stop and think about what's the easiest way to do this. And you come up with a very simple experiment and you learn something. And then you go, well, you know what? For my next experiment, I want to do something a little more sophisticated because I want to learn how that worked within there. And you'll see that come up as I talk about these things. And you should come up with your own ideas for things you want to experiment on. Like I said, be inquisitive, think, always be asking questions and never stop. And it's like I always say, if we can dream it, we can always do it because we're using our imaginations and thinking about things. So that's my tip for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this video and have a great day.
What's your point, David?